Vowel or consonant?
Todos los niños le gustan hablar. Every child wants to speak and be heard and communicate. Sí, muy bien. But
oral language, listening and talking, is the primary means by which babies and toddlers learn about the world. By preschool, children's vocabulary size can predict their ability to comprehend texts throughout school. And, as a general rule, the poorer the child, the weaker their vocabulary skills. But not always. Because the fact is that all children thrive when they are given lots of shared time with parents and caregivers. What else is in here?
Fish!
Time spent speaking, playing, singing, reading, asking, and answering questions.
Good job.
This is the best way to nurture your child's development before school and throughout life.
what can we do to help our children learn? We could start talking and looking and pointing and interacting right from when they come home.
You want to read?
She's going to show you, she turns the page. Just to get them used to interacting and talking and responding to cues.
The disparity between our children is enormous, and it's based on environmental differences and not on ability differences. These poor children are highly capable and eager to learn, but they haven't had the rich opportunities they need in order to be supported in learning. And that's what Let's Talk is all about. We're focusing on understanding the disparities, but then doing something about it.
Remember, everybody has to hear it, so you're going to speak nice and loud, okay?
And what we want to see is instruction that is more deliberate, systematic, that enables these children to get a head start so that they can come to school with a more level playing field.
Hello, yellow bird. Who are you? I'm 4 years old. I'm a boy.
The most critical thing we find is vocabulary. Expose them to it, because a lot of them do not come in exposed to it.
Let's Talk is an exciting initiative whose goal is to provide families and educators with information, strategies, and resources that they can use to help children from infancy to school age and beyond, using simple activities and talking.
It's red? Nice job. Children can be spoken to in normal tones of voice, in adult language. What else do you see as red? Once you take things in, they can give things back to you in reference to language, so they're much more expressive. Do you remember the red flowers we saw outside? Yeah? What else is red? What else looks like this?
By engaging in conversation with your child, you are helping them in ways that last forever. Talk to them, read to them, ask questions, and listen. Explain what you're seeing and doing while you're making dinner, shopping, or just taking a walk. You are helping to expand their vocabulary and knowledge of the world. And don't worry about whether or not they get it. Their brains are making connections all over the place.
You're reading to them, you're pointing things out to them, playing a game with them. They're building pathways to absorb new knowledge later on. And they need that to keep up in today's world.
It's a huge difference when they have background experience from home, hearing all the words, being exposed to vocabulary. Little Missy says hello.
And remember to have fun. You are your child's best teacher and favorite plaything. Sing, chant, clap, play with rhythms and rhymes.
I find it's easier to get children to talk when they are interested in something. Get them to learn a whole lot faster, and they're more motivated when they're interested in what's going on.
What's this?
He's sweating because the sun is so hot.
Don't be afraid to challenge children by exposing them to interesting words and big ideas. You don't have to have money to give your child a good head start. Ideas and conversations cost nothing.
You found my secret.
Senator Elizabeth Warren.
good to be here. Thank you. Thank you, Mary Catherine. You know, it's terrific to be here in a room full of people who value teaching, and also a room full of wonks who want to talk about how we make college more affordable. This country is in trouble. We're trying to build a 21st century economy in a competitive world environment. The most basic building block of that economy is a highly educated workforce. Today, 59% of American jobs require some post-secondary education, and that number will keep on growing. But our plan to develop that workforce is faltering. There's no shortage of people hoping to get a college degree and willing to work for it. The problem is how much they'll need to pay for it. College costs are exploding. Adjusted for inflation, a student going to a state school today, now think about this, adjusted for inflation, will pay tuition that is 300% of what her mom or dad paid just 30 years ago. Now, lots of people go to college anyway, taking on huge debt loads to make it possible. In just the past year, the student loan debt has jumped another $100 billion, $100 billion in just 1 year. More than 2/3 of four-year college grads have borrowed money to get through school, with average debt loads now at about $30,000. Low and middle income families, of course, are the ones who are hit the hardest. This debt load is squeezing millions of young people and squeezing them hard. Data show that young Americans with student loan debt are putting off buying homes, saving for retirement, starting businesses. And the more people finance to pay for their educations, the more the resulting debt slows the economy. Already, the Treasury Department, the Federal Reserve, and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau have sounded the alarm that mounting student debt is a real drag on economic growth. And that's why this country is in trouble. Our economy cannot flourish if we do not have enough college-educated workers.
I feel as if I am the poster child for the Brown versus the board. And what I would like to do, my contribution, is to really give you a personal view of what it's meant to me, what it's the last 60 years, the impact of this decision, and of course the role that I and the other 8 played in Little Rock in 1957 and 1958. But before discussing Brown, I have to reveal that I came out of a family of teachers. My mother and my aunt were long-term teachers in Little Rock. And that part of the Little Rock case was enhanced by a teacher pay equity case that was brought by a black teacher in Little Rock in the late 1940s. Sue Cowan Williams. That case was the lawyer that represented Sue Cowan Williams was Thurgood Marshall. And that you scholars, I think many of the early school desegregation cases in the South arose out of pay equity issues around teachers. My mother and aunt were also involved in this case because the teacher that was the plaintiff, the moment she filed the suit, you know what happened next. She was fired. And my mother and a group of teachers in Little Rock pooled together their meager resources and provided for 2 years financial support for the plaintiff. And they weren't wealthy people, so that was a sacrifice. But in addition to that, those of you who are of my generation know that when Thurgood Marshall came to Little Rock to try that case, he was not staying at the Holiday Inn or the Hilton. and he stayed at homes, and our home was one of those. So I point this out that this teacher, mild-mannered woman, had the guts to stand up at that point in time, and there, many of us know that that was a big sacrifice, a huge step forward, and a belief that some changes ought to occur. And she maintained her NAACP membership, which for someone on the public side of activity was another bold statement. So when the decision came down on May 17th, I don't remember much about May 17th, but I do remember May 18th. The local newspaper had headline banners that were at least, seemed to me, the size of this table, that said this was going to be the change of life in the South. And I thought to myself, as a 13-year-old, that the life ought to be changed in the South, because what I saw as the petty inconveniences of Jim Crow, buses, public accommodations, restaurants, places we couldn't go, I thought change needed to occur. But I was befuddled because after the decision came down, and my second remembrance was, how was this going to get done? And the court said, with all deliberate speed. I was confused, as I think a number of people. But Little Rock became this focal point mainly because of outstanding leadership, Daisy Bates, Wiley Branton, parents like my mother and others who felt that once the suit and the NAACP sued the Little Rock School Board, and they finally agreed to a plan of action, which was to take the high schools, one high school in Little Rock, and admit a number of African American students.
I love talking about North Carolina in events like this because, as I'm sure you all know, North Carolina doesn't have collective bargaining power for unions. We have just an association of educators. So that means it's not possible to blame some of the undesirable outcomes on unions. Those undesirable outcomes, in many cases, just reflect the operation of the teacher labor market. I would argue that's the case in other states as well, but it's easier to make that strong statement in the context of North Carolina. I've listed in your handout some of the sources on which I'm relying. I do a lot of work with various colleagues at Duke, and I think a couple of the papers are in your packet. Before I get into the issue that I want to focus on, which is what are the policy options to make it easier to not only get accomplished teachers into high-need schools, but as Richard emphasized, to retain them. And I think retention is an important part. I've just provided a little data in the handout. I'll go very quickly. In North, my colleagues and I have done a lot of analysis, just distributional type of analysis. We divided all the schools by level, elementary school level, middle, and high school, by the percentage of students in poverty. So quartile 1 schools are those with the highest percentages of poverty. And the only thing I'm showing in this first graph is that whatever level of schooling you're talking about, we have higher proportions of novice teachers or teachers with less than 3 years of experience. If you go to the next graph, you see a graph that goes in the other direction, but that's because I'm talking about a characteristic that we all believe to be positive and has shown to be positive for student achievement, national board certification. North Carolina has a very high percentage of teachers who are nationally board certified, but here we have a similar pattern, goes in the other direction, but consistent with the first graph, which is the high poverty schools have lower proportions of National Board Certified Teachers. So I just present that as background. The next slide simply says, this pattern that I've shown for these two qualifications of teachers apply or emerge for every other characteristic that I've looked at, such as percentage of or average teacher licensure test scores, or uncertified teachers, or teachers from highly ranked education institutions or whatever. And also, if I did this for principals with slightly different measures of qualifications, the same pattern would emerge. So that's just the starting point for where I want to go. Now, the next slide talks very briefly about the explanation for this. And what I'm focusing on here is the differences between the high-need schools and the lower-need schools. We all know that the working conditions in the high-need schools are difficult, and they're not fully compensated for by salary differentials. So we know that from the data, and I've looked at patterns of teacher movement, but lots of people have done this for other states as well. Teachers move away from high-need schools. They might start out in a high-need school, and they move to schools with lower proportions of needy students. The result is higher teacher turnover in those high-need schools. So then they have to hire more teachers. The teachers they hire are often the less experienced teachers. That's consistent with the data that I gave you. And in addition, some of this movement is exacerbated by accountability pressures. That was particularly true in North Carolina, and we've documented that. We had a pretty good accountability system for a while before No Child Left Behind. We still have it in part, that focused on gains in student achievement, and it had bonuses for teachers in the high-performing schools. But what did that mean? That the teachers who were in the high-need schools couldn't earn those bonuses if they remained in those schools. So this exacerbated the movement of the teachers with strong qualifications out of those schools toward other schools.
Let me thank you for allowing us to be here, allowing me to be here, and I say us because back in the Forward Together Moral movement, we have a phrase that "we" is the most important word in the justice vocabulary. The issue is not what I can do, but we can do when we pray together, stand together, mobilize together, litigate together, and most of all, stay together. Let me thank the Albert Shanker Institute, Leo, for this invitation, and you have given me two of my kind of life dreams. The first one was to get close enough to Mary Wright Edelman to hug her. And I've been waiting 31 years, long time. I've been waiting a long time. I'm 51 years old. I read her so much in college, and she doesn't know she was such an inspiration to me when I was in school via her readings and her quotes. And then to come here and hear a Washington Post editor start off with scripture, that's a pretty, Maul Monday is working somewhere. But I thank you, EJ, for all that you do and how I was ready to go after you finished, really, for stirring us and reminding us, because I don't think there can be today or any time a separation from the academy and activists. I think we have to keep it all tied together. What I want today, and it's interesting how, Brother Dion, we are channeling each other, because I wanted to start in the same place that you started, because I'm always thinking that part of our work in the public square is to take back what persons who call themselves ultra this or ultra that, ultra conservative, have taken. I think we have, first of all, to recapture linguistically the language of democracy. You know, when some of these, I always stutter at this point because I do not like the phrase conservative and liberal. And I'm waiting when we can get out of that framework, because I think it has locked us into a place. Because I don't know how people call themselves conservative who keep wanting to undermine the fundamental values of our Constitution. To conserve means to hold on to the essence of. I don't know why we continue to use language from the French Revolution to describe our reality in America, left versus right. I linguistically have a problem calling somebody right that I think is so wrong. And you know, in the French Revolution, the right were the ones on the side who wanted to keep the king, and the left were the other side. And so I'm really pushing that we do need to be more constitutional in our language, more faith-based, more moral in our language, not just for others, but to liberate ourselves. And so I too want to start with that language. And though the framers had some moral, political deficiencies, surely, but as Thurgood Marshall suggested one time, one of the best things about our Constitution is that it could be amended. And they did say, however, and I don't believe they alone were writing this. I believe there was a greater power at work somewhere for you to say in the 1700s, we the people of the United States, in order for a more perfect union. That's a confession, y'all. That's what we would call that in church. I'm confessing I'm not perfect, and I have somewhere that I need to move to. And then what is interesting to me is that when we have many of our political people running for office politically, notice how many times they say freedom, particularly on certain parts of the aisle. Freedom, 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 freedom. And everybody's saying freedom. Why are you running? Freedom. Why are you against health care? Freedom. Why are you against taxes? Freedom. Why are you for taxes? Freedom, freedom, freedom. And what's interesting to me is that is not the first word in our Constitution. There is no concept of this kind of benign freedom. It is a qualified freedom that must begin with establishment of justice. And then there must be an insurance of domestic tranquility. And then there must be provisions for the common defense. And then there must be not merely a wanting welfare, but an actual promoting, active promoting of the general welfare of all people. And then our Constitution suggests you might be able to pass on the blessings of liberty to your posterity. But there is no way you can just say freedom without it being qualified. There's a little book out now that actually says the only kind of capitalism that is approved in our Constitution is human rights capitalism. That if, in fact, our policies do not establish justice and promote welfare, promote the general welfare, then they are actually out of bounds with the vision of our Constitution. Now, having read that, I want to suggest today, Leo, this, that defending the public square is a moral assertion, not just a political one. Even though I do believe politics are moral, I believe economics is a moral issue, health care is a moral issue, and I think part of our problem is that we have moved away from understanding issues from this perspective. But to suggest that we need to defend the public square is a moral assertion. And because of that, I want to suggest that moral dissenters are a necessity for this democracy. They're not just, moral dissenters are not something that can come and go. The very necessity, the very life of our democracy depends on moral dissenters. If we are going to ever move and continue to move toward a more perfect union, or what the Constitution in North Carolina says when they rewrote it right after slavery, all political power is vested in and comes from the people and should only be used for the good of the whole.
Here's the solution I would propose. We should use multiple measures of learning to assess student learning. We should not rely simply on the state test, which is restricted in the way that it is. We should have a basket of evidence that teachers develop around goal setting matched to the curriculum and the students that they teach, which can include local, state, and national tests and assessments, and can include authentic assessments of various kinds, essays, research projects, investigations, and so on. Can include English proficiency gains for English learners, accomplishment of learner goals, and other measures. So in Maria's case, her basket of evidence might include the English language proficiency test gains for her new English learners in that class. They might include the developmental reading assessment, which is a profile that allows you to evaluate reading gains across a continuum from kindergarten all the way to 12th grade. They might include the state test, but they ought to be a big asterisk on that because it's a very poor measure for what she's teaching and who her kids are. In Carolyn's case, her basket of evidence should have included the Regents test scores, which were really what her kids were studying, and maybe she would give a pre-test in the beginning of the year about their knowledge of that curriculum so that you could see what their gains were by the end of the year. They might include the state test with a big asterisk on it because it doesn't really measure her kids around the curriculum they were learning. But they could also include the math exhibition that they did at the end of the year where the kids were doing an investigatory project applying their math knowledge. So we need to get to a place where the use of these measures is really productive for student learning and teacher learning. In an integrated system where we don't have a metric on the side, a value-added number over here, which may or may not be accurate, but where you have standards-based measures of practice linked to what's going on with your measures of student learning and professional contributions. In a book I just finished called Getting Teacher Evaluation Right, I give a lot of examples of districts that have done this, where teachers are in fact using goal setting around standards, sometimes individually, sometimes in teams and groups, sometimes in departments, where they're coached by a mentor or a principal around both what they're doing in the classroom and what the evidence of student learning is showing and how those relate to one another, and where sometimes this is being used to produce department-wide and team-wide changes in practice as well as individual changes in practice. Student learning objectives are one way to do that in a goal-setting process that can be individual or collective. They can use a wide range of measures, including state, national, district tests of various kinds. And they can also support collaboration when they're used in the right way. We should also, and I'm closing here, remember that if we want effectiveness at the end of the day, then we should think about all the things that make teachers effective, evaluation being only one. And if we look at the literature on what counts, we should be worrying then about high-quality preparation and mentoring, putting teachers in the right assignments and conditions that allow them to be effective, allowing them to have those collegial learning opportunities that boost collective effectiveness as well as individual effectiveness, having a coherent curriculum that allows kids to make greater gains, as well as evaluation systems that have all of these different components.
The beauty of unions, in my experience, is that it creates a set of relationships that you can't have anywhere else in American civil society at this moment. Because we are so segregated from each other in our churches, in our housing, in our, that our work and our advocacy organization makes us come together and have to understand each other's lives. So the beauty of that diversity, from my perspective, is a way that we are trying to help our members from every walk of life. The white conservative in Michigan, corrections officer who felt like primarily he, there's 10% that are she, had no other choice but to either become a corrections officer or to leave their home in order to fend for themselves and their families, and how that person's situation is similar to our African American home care and nursing home workers, and how those two are connected to the Muslim American who's terrified because of the ban. on and on and on. So I think the thing that there's three things we're trying to do that avoid circling the wagons and that are centered in how do we help each working person understand that it's in their self-interest to join these broader fights and redefine the role of the union from simply wage and benefit protection to a civic organization that is going to fight for justice on every front. And those fights for justice, whether they directly impact me and my family, have to be won in order for me and my family to do better. And connecting those dots and making the case is what we're obsessed with right now. And there's three ways we're trying to do it. One is through a member campaign that I know AFT, AFSCME, NEA, many other parts of the labor movement are recommitting our members to their organization. And in our case, we're trying to do it through an education, organizing, leadership empowerment campaign that also redefines the purpose of what I'm committing to as people sign their membership card, and then also authorize us to direct join mechanism. So it's an internal organizing campaign where between now and March, we're trying to figure out 7 different ways in which we engage those members in some fight for justice, whether it's racial justice, depending on what's happening in their city or geography, on felon re-enfranchisement, bail reform for the criminal justice system, whatever, or immigrant justice, which is in our face at the moment as it relates to the DREAM Act and the expiration of temporary protected status for El Salvadorans, Hondurans, and Haitians in the next 4 months. Or environmental justice, which is in our face in Texas, Puerto Rico, Florida, and connecting those ways for people to see their union as a way to address what feels to many families in this nation now as an escalating crisis. And then the second thing we're trying to do is protect and expand the resources we're committing to non-union workers in joining our union members in that fight for justice. And so we're trying to open up bigger organizing campaigns than we've done in the last 10 years, which, as you can imagine, is a little counterintuitive as we're reducing current resource.
Yeah.
But people see it in our that's how workers won unions as we were born 100 years ago, and we think it's how workers will prevail in this moment. So we're trying to drive the conversation about, as loud as 15 has become, can we join and make a standard that workers have to join unions in order to protect our democracy as something that we punctuate in the 18 midterm, the 20 presidential, the 22 and beyond. And then the third thing we're trying to make the case on with our members is we can't do this by ourselves. And what is it that we're going to do differently to join with the rest of the labor movement makes sense to people because it's their lived experience in a lot of communities. But how we as labor come as equals to a table of environmental, LGBTQ, racial justice, the historic civil rights, the women's movement, etc., as equals, even when we have more resources than the rest of the ecosystem, is something we're trying to train and practice ourselves to do at the city and state level. And there's great examples. We think Minnesota is a good example of how the trade union movement has figured out how to be partners of equal, even when the resources of the other organizations aren't the same. And they've had a pattern of winning on fights when they join together that we can point to and make as the self-interest of our members. So those are the 3 ways that we are helping our members learn that circling the wagons, while it feels like the right instinct, isn't the way to win or to realize our vision for justice in this country.
Thanks.
Let me just
sure.
Because I think our unions have very similar strategies of engagement, even in a period of time when you would expect us to be reducing funding in those areas. People within the AFT, whether they understand that member engagement and community involvement go hand in hand. So for example, we have not cut our commitment, we shaved it a tiny bit, but we've not cut our commitment to the community engagement that we're doing. And every bit of, and in fact, the focus in terms of the multiple pathways of engagement, because the members have to see themselves in the advocacy. They see themselves in the advocacy, then there is real engagement, because there is power in collective advocacy, but people don't talk that way. And people don't think about it that way. They think about it much more. Mary Kay talks about self-interest. People have to see themselves. They have to see their interest in it. So we keep saying we have to make sure, we have to find ways and pathways that the members see themselves in the advocacy. And some of them will see it in social justice, and some of them will see it in community involvement, but it all comes under an umbrella that we fight. We don't just resist. We fight for a better life for people. So we fight against things and we fight for things. And underlying that in the union movement of today, we care deeply, not just about each other, but about our communities. So that both of us are finding ways of engagement, not just with the muscle and not just with the head, which is what our union used to do really, really well, but with the heart. And so and you can see it in, we may use different words, but you're seeing that kind of engagement, and AFSCME is doing the same, and NEA is doing the same.
Let me start off by making a point that needs to be made over and over again, because I fear that some of my colleagues in the Congress and certainly many of our fellow Americans don't know. And that is that the people of Puerto Rico are American citizens and must be treated as full American citizens. It seems obvious, but there are some parts of the Congress in which people are deeply concerned about the problems from the hurricanes in Florida and Texas, not so much in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. And that is an issue we cannot lose focus on. Other point that I would make is that all of you know that we are the wealthiest nation in the history of the world. We're not a poor nation. Yet, more than 5 months after Hurricanes Irma and Maria struck Puerto Rico, more than 30%, over 900,000 people, are still without electricity on the island. About 270 schools still lack electricity. Some areas of Puerto Rico will not see power until as late as the end of May, about 8 months after Hurricane Maria pummeled the island. Think about it for a moment. The wealthiest, most powerful nation in the history of the world, with incredible resources that could destroy half of the world at a moment's notice, and yet some 900,000 fellow American citizens are still without electricity. Do you think that would be happening in Westchester County, New York? Probably not. Not in Los Angeles, not in Burlington, Vermont. There is something very wrong in that picture. Furthermore, more than 200,000 people have left the island since Maria. Some 27,000 of the 350,000 students attending public school in Puerto Rico before the storm are now attending schools on the mainland. More than 160 schools have already been closed, and hundreds more are being considered for closure as the population continues to erode and intense pressure mounts to transition to private charter schools. That is not acceptable, and we are here today to tell the people of Puerto Rico that they are not forgotten, that they are not alone, and that we will do everything we possibly can to rebuild the island.
I think we should spend a little less time thinking about Trump, in all honesty, and that we should spend more time thinking about the American people, who we are, what we need to be. And to underscore what I mean, let me say this. I want us to think about our institutions for a second. All the big buildings in Washington, the Capitol, the Supreme Court, the White House, et cetera, all the Capitol buildings in states and so forth. Those things constitute an asset, a huge body of property in many ways owned by all of us. We all have an ownership stake in them. But it's worth thinking more about what those institutions are, because the other thing that they are actually is a concretized, concrete form of knowledge, all right? So you had all these people in the 1700s and then over the course of the 1800s who tried to think about this question of how ordinary people, not aristocrats, men, yes, but nonetheless, the conception of ordinary people, can do collective decision-making together. And they had some people, in Massachusetts who spent a lot of time practicing in town hall meetings, and they had people in other places practicing in other kinds of forms, and they learned stuff. They had actual knowledge about how to build institutions in order to check power and in order to distribute power in some kind of egalitarian way, egalitarian in contrast to what they knew from Europe. And they didn't write philosophical treatises Okay, like Federalist Papers is great and exciting, but it's not a philosophical treatise. They didn't actually take the time to write an encyclopedia of everything they'd figured out. They just built institutions. Those institutions, again, are these deposits of knowledge. Now, the problem with storing knowledge that way is people lose sight of the fact that that's what those institutions are, actual treasuries of insight, wisdom, discovery. And I would say that this democracy has been at risk for decades because we, the people, have lost the knowledge that went into building those things. And consequently, we barely know how to operate them. All right? And I'd been kind of having this sneaking suspicion for some time, to be honest, like all of you. You've been working on civic education for a long time here. It's not like we just started a year ago, right? And I'd kind of been noticing things like the fact that we've been investing so much in STEM education is important and meaningful, but has anybody noticed that the more a student is focusing on STEM, the less likely they are to participate? So our investments in STEM have been simultaneously eroding our democratic capacities. I've been noticing, I have these concerns about the knowledge that had been passed down through generations in the form of our institutions and whether we still had it. And then we had the election, and I had, in all honesty, my worry had been focused on young people. Were they getting enough time on civics? Were they getting enough time not just to learn about the structure of institutions, but to understand the nature of agency, of personal empowerment, the skills, personal skills of speech, of interaction with other people, of imagination, of courage necessary to operate these institutions? Were they learning these things? I've been worried about the young people. And then after the election, I got so many calls and inquiries from people who wanted to know what to do. I mean, more or less people my age and somewhat older. And they didn't know what to do. And that really blew me away. That I literally had to sit down with people and say, okay, here's how you run a meeting. Here's how you chair a meeting. Here's how you start brainstorming what the problems in your community are, in your city, in your state, and then get to the country. And here's how you prioritize. And once you figured out what the things you care most about, here's how you find your menu of policy possibilities. And here's how you start evaluating which ones are the best ones. And here's how you find allies. Find allies to help you advance that cause. All right, now to me, this stuff is really basic. And I think it's probably basic around here, anybody who's been part of an organizing tradition. But that knowledge is almost gone, as best as I can tell, through most of our society. So really, my goodness, we just have such a big job to do recovering bodies of knowledge that once upon a time were deeply embedded in our culture. Now, how does this relate to issues of race and equity? I think we have a challenge that's specific to our own generation here, but it's still a knowledge and a skills challenge. This country has been plagued by racial injustice from the beginning. And we sit at a moment where very soon, no particular ethnic group will be in the majority in this country. And we've never known how to operate political systems where that's true. We've operated political systems for centuries based on the conception that somebody was in the majority and somebody was in the minority. And it's worked all the way through our concepts, the conceptual structures of our judicial system, everywhere. So the fact of the matter is, as we work towards building an equitable society, a multicultural society, we don't just have to recover bodies of knowledge that we've lost, we simultaneously need to innovate. All right, discover the solution to developing egalitarian institutions in a multicultural context. So my metaphor for all of this is always that we have to rebuild the ship while we're trying to sail it.
So let me answer the question, is there a pension crisis? Absolutely. Just not the one that you hear about on TV, that you hear politicians talk about, or that's in the newspapers. Pensions are the second most efficient and effective way through market economics to provide for income in old age. The most effective way is a national program that spreads risks to everyone The least efficient way to do it is through defined contribution plans, of which there is abundant evidence that while they work very well as supplements for prosperous people like my wife and I, my wife is a CEO, are not at all effective for most people, and they violate one of the most basic tenets of market economics as taught to us by the man who first explained market economics, Adam Smith, and that is specialization. How many of you would perform surgery on yourself? Or your spouse? Or dentistry? How many of you do your own plumbing? It is specialization that makes for efficiency and creates wealth. But when we move to a defined contribution plan, if we have any plan at all, for people to retire, we make the assumption that everyone is competent to be an investment manager, and they're not. Furthermore, they pay high prices, and the evidence shows that their performance is atrocious. In down markets, defined contribution plans lose about 25% more than professionally managed defined benefit pension plans, and in up markets, they earn about 25% less. To think that most people can be specialists in every field is to defy one of the defining principles of modern wealth creation. So why are defined benefit pension plans being described everywhere as in a state of crisis? The answer to that is very simple: systematic theft. Pensions are earned. They are not anything but wages that could have been taken today and instead are deferred for old age. There's more about this in my column today in Al Jazeera America, which goes through a number of areas where we have politicians and the journalists who accurately parrot what they say, misinforming us about fundamental economic concepts. We often hear politicians talk about contributions to the plan. This creates the impression that they are a gift or a gratuity. They are not. Workers receive a level of compensation, often referred to as a package. How that is divvied up, how much is paid immediately in cash wages, how much goes for vacations, how much goes for sick leave, how much goes for health insurance, how much goes into a retirement plan, is mere economics. It is not economics. As both a legal and an economic principle, all the money in a pension plan is earned by the workers. Now, I have talked about this before and immediately get people who go, wait a minute, the taxpayers put the money in for teachers. No, they didn't. The taxpayers exchanged their dollars for the work of the teachers. And once the teachers are paid, it is their money, they earned it. This is true of state troopers and everybody else who has a job.
What I wanted to talk about, though, is more specifically about teachers and classrooms. And teacher education. 15 to 20 years ago, I think what we heard a lot about cultural relevance, culture, community connection in the education of marginalized low-income students of color. Now, what we're focused much more on is the notion of academic rigor, with the idea of Common Core state standards and some of the programs that, like KIP, for example, that are moving through our inner cities. And I'd say historically you have a very hard time getting both of them together, academic rigor and the notion of cultural relevance, support, community support. Recently, well, a while ago, the Chicago Consortium on Chicago School Research, Valerie Lee et al. Looked at what was it that made schools successful in producing kids who scored high on tests. And they said it was two things: academic press and social support. Academic press is the rigor notion. What we're looking for is academic rigor, high-level thinking, demanding curriculum, again, connected to the much needed, in my view, notions of Common Core. Social support is something else again. It includes knowing your students, connecting the curriculum to the community and to students' interests, creating a sense of safety and belonging, building relationships with students and parents. One example about a sense of safety and belonging, some research that was done by Nilda Flores Gonzalez in 2002 called School Kids, Street Kids. She looked at Latino students and found that those who dropped out, compared those who dropped out in high school to those who stayed in school. And she found that one of the biggest determinants between those two groups was how much they felt they belonged in elementary school, how connected they felt to the teachers, to relationships. And my experience with certainly other children, many other children of color would suggest the same. It also means helping children, students overcome the societal stereotypes of their intellectual inferiority. And this is, I believe, still an unexplored area in education, and it's even, I think, a taboo area in many instances. If you want to take a look at what this looks like in a high school girl, Kiri Davis, did a little video, it's on YouTube, called A Girl Like Me. And others have done it, but it was a re-look at the Kenneth Clark doll studies, where little 3- and 4-year-old black children, shown a white doll and a black doll, continue now to say, and one of my grad students just redid the study in Louisiana, to say that the white doll is prettier, the white doll is nicer, and the white doll is smarter. The title of my book, Multiplication is for White People, actually came from a quote from a child who said to her tutor, "What you trying to teach me this multiplication for, Miss L? Black people don't multiply. Black people just add and subtract. White people multiply." So there is a lot that's, most times kids don't state it that blatantly. One of the things you will hear them say, however, and a lot of my teachers tell me this, if they're in a poor school, low-income school, or an F school that somebody has designated, then the kids will say to the teacher who is attempting to be academically rigorous, Miss Fontenot, why are you trying to teach us this? This is Baker. In other words, we are not, should not be expected. So that's one of the things that our teachers need to be able to counter as well.
I want to talk about the interaction that you've been discussing here between civil society, as we often call it, those private groups that were on that map, and the public sector and what we do in common through government. And I think one of the problems in our politics is that we have utterly separated in our minds and in our analyses the link between what we do in common through government and what we do in common through our private organizations. That would include unions, it includes churches, it includes charitable groups, it includes community organizers. We've tried to draw this very sharp line. And I agree with my conservative friends when they speak very warmly of all the institutions of civil society. As some of you know, I'm a Catholic, and I admire the church, that the work that religious organizations, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, and Muslim, have done both to be charitable and to secure justice. But what we forget is that throughout our history, we have understood that many times those organizations could not take up the entire task of charity, and charity itself is not sufficient because what we ought to seek is justice. And many of these groups dedicated themselves not simply to charity, but also to justice. Mike Conjal, a wonderful scholar at the Roosevelt Institute, wrote a piece for Democracy, the other great quarterly magazine, by the way, along with Dissent. I'm involved with Democracy, and I love Dissent. He wrote a piece in Democracy where he quoted Harry Truman in a 1946 radio address kicking off the community chest campaign, which is kind of a predecessor to the United Way. And this is Truman. He said, "I like the campaign slogan this year, everybody gives, everybody benefits. It marks a significant change in our thinking about the word charity. Today, our contributions to the community chest are not alms given by the wealthy few to the poor. The government, through its public welfare program, has long since accepted its responsibility to see that no citizen face hunger, unemployment, or a destitute old age. The word charity has regained its old true meaning, that of goodwill toward one's fellow man, of brotherhood, of mutual help, of love." Yes, Harry Truman, that crusty president of ours, spoke about love. And I am always struck when there are those folks, again, among my conservative friends, who say, well, let us replace some of these fundamental functions of government with private charity. And first, I always tell them that, you know, the most significant insight, I think, of theological insight of conservatives is a belief in fallen human nature, in the flaws of we human beings. Reinhold Niebuhr once said that the only empirically verifiable doctrine of the Christian church is original sin. And I think he had a point on that. And yet, somehow, human beings are very flawed, except at that moment when it comes to charity. And then what we hear is that only if government gets out of the way, then we will all suddenly become very generous and take care not only of the neighbor down the street, which we might well do, but people across town whom we've never met, people across the country whom we will never know. And the establishment of government assistance, I think, was a response to our bad conscience, that we understood that we had this obligation to our brothers and sisters that we would not live up to in our private charity.
So we have to broaden our conceptions of standards. I want to say the Schott Foundation's been a leader on this, and I applaud the work of focusing on opportunity to learn standards. And to me, that's part of the shift we've got to begin to make. Are qualified teachers in the schools? Is there access to adequate facilities and learning materials? Are we addressing the non-academic needs of children? The analogy I would make is the way we think about accountability in airports, in highways, in the water supply. We don't hold consumers accountable. We hold those who build the roads and run the airports and put out the food, hold them accountable and hold them to the standards that are set. There's not a single state in the country that holds itself accountable for the conditions in schools. Not one. I'll come back to that as we look at state control of schools. So we need to rethink the assumptions guiding our policy. I would say right now, and we heard Josh speak to this already, there's an assumption that low-performing schools are simply staffed by lazy people, and if you pressure them enough, humiliate them enough, shut their schools down, they will improve. We have absolutely no evidence that this will work. Right? But we see that strategy being pursued throughout the country. We continue to believe that just threatening kids with denying them a diploma will be an incentive. In many cases, these, again, are kids who've known nothing but failure in schools. Again, not a great strategy. And then we have very little evidence that just giving kids the option to choose is going to solve this, because there are lots of schools that don't choose kids with great needs. School choice only works if there's lots and lots of good choices. And if the schools don't choose, but in fact parents choose. And there's not a system that works like that today. So I would add that we've got to get better at learning about why the reforms we've pursued haven't worked. Right? I mean, Josh already talked to the PISA results, which show on the international comparisons we're falling further and further behind. So something is clearly wrong with what we're doing. And I would say it's not simply money, though money's always part of the equation. I would say that we focus too much on gimmicks and fads. We keep thinking there's a silver bullet. Right now, the Common Core, at least for some, is the game changer. There is no game changer. Let's face that. It always comes down to the basic ingredients. The University of Chicago said there were 5 essential ingredients: the capacity of the educational staff, leadership, school culture, parent engagement, and continuous support for the education staff, the teachers in the schools. And I would say if we ignore those things, we will never get to where we need to be. We have to work much more at doing reform with the people who work in our schools, not to them. We don't do this in other industries. Right? If you think about, in most other industries, if we talk about banking or the military or healthcare, the professional associations have a lot of say on the kinds of policies that are adopted. Not true in education. In education, I often say, those who know the least have the most say. Those who know the most have no say at all. And it shows in the kinds of policies we pursue.
I wanted to show you 2 magazine covers, and then I want to think about them for a moment. This one is from 1950, and it's entitled U.S. Schools, They Face a Crisis. And it's about Winnetka High School. But in any case, there's all kinds of interesting articles, but I do find this title by Bernard Bell. He says, know how versus know why. And I think we're in a crisis of knowing of the why question right now as to what the function of schools is and what the function of democracy is. The second one is 1958. This is the hardworking Russian kid who's going to take over the world. And this is the lazy American kid who is 1958, who is going to allow the communists to take over because he doesn't do enough homework. And a lot of other things in here. Now, I wonder what this kid is, if you look 20 years later, 1968 or 78, when the American economy was very strong and the Russian economy was going downhill, whether the authors of this issue of Life rethought about that question. In any case, it's always interesting when schools are in a crisis and who has discovered the crisis. There's a wonderful book by Richard Rothstein, which when I want to have a lighter mood about the world, I reread, called The Way Things Were. And he starts back at about 1860 with the crises in American education. In 1900, around 1900, he has some wonderful quotes, including from it wasn't the New York Times, but another one of the prominent New York papers, about how kids today, they can't write a simple sentence correctly. That was in a time, he's talking about college kids, at a time when maybe 3% of the American public was going to college. And this was a crisis. Exactly interesting to me that in 1983 is about the time when the inequality issue begins in America. It's about the time when some people are getting a lot richer and other people. It's about the time the trade union movement is falling apart. And so the Nation at Risk focused on schools, in which the teachers might have been foreign saboteurs. There's some sentence like that. I can't remember the exact words. And I think the 2008, when you're talking about the impact on kids of our poor school system, think of the impact on low-income and black kids of the 2008 financial crisis. It wiped out far more black families, middle class, black families who had reached the middle class were incredibly affected by that because they had so much invested in home ownership. There hasn't been, I think I'm right, a single person put in jail for what everyone knows was an act of deception that unfairly impacted the children of America. But we think the crisis is in the schools. Now, I see a connection.
We just issued a new report on child poverty and how we want to end it right now, can end it right now, can't afford not to end it right now. It is a moral disgrace that we have 14.7 million children in the world's largest economy who are living in poverty, 6.5 million of them living in extreme poverty. And it's going to be our undoing. I feel like a broken record going on all the time to say that our greatest national economic and military security problem is not from the enemy, any enemy without. It's from our failure to invest in our children right now. So we asked the Urban Institute to take 9 programs that we knew work and ask them to quantify the poverty alleviation impact if we fully funded them now, and what could that do? And they came back, and what would it cost? And they came back and told us that if we invested in things that made work pay and in work, minimum wage, fundable child tax credits, earned income tax credit, and all of there, and the report is up on the web, that we could decrease child poverty now by 60%, and black child poverty by 72%. The cost would be $77 billion, about 2% of the federal budget. But that's a bargain because it cost us about $500 billion every year that we let 13, 14, 15 million children live in poverty. And so we are determined to mount a massive campaign to end poverty, to make work available, to make work pay, and to stop this absolute travesty of having our children grow up without enough to eat, without a place to sleep, without the stability of knowing that they live in a country that cares about them. Dr. King, I quote all the time because in his last week and then in his last day, he had called his mother to give her his next Sunday sermon title. And it was Why America May Go to Hell. And at his death, as you know, which is the origin and the parent organization of the Children's Defense Fund, he was calling for a Poor People's Campaign to do away with poverty. And it was a major turning point because it was the first cross-racial attempt to move beyond narrow civil rights into economic rights, which involved blacks, whites, Latinos, Native Americans, and that was an important turning point, and it is one which we seek to continue to live today in building a constituency for all children, but paying particular attention to the children who are at the bottom, children of color.
We're moving towards having one party that is predominantly a white party and the other party that is dominated by minority voters at a time when minority population is increasing about 2% every year. Throw in an enhanced race factor, and obviously you can see how that's played out in the years of the Obama presidency, with starker racist terminology used to characterize the president, and now with some of the divisions that we see in perceptions and on the streets, whether it's Ferguson or Baltimore or other places. Throw in a racial component in a heightened way to partisan tribalism. And we've got a problem, folks, that's going to get much worse. And we are not immune from the kind of sectarianism that has hit many other societies. So this is troubling beyond the questions of whether we can somehow make reasonable educational policy or solve our economic dilemmas, or even deal with the huge problem of inequality and growing inequality. There are other factors here that we're going to have to deal with. Now I've got your attention. Let me throw in a few other things. Rui mentioned the asymmetric polarization, which is clearly the case, and we have lots of data to support it. And one of the problems that exists out there now is that there is no penalty for a party that moves off the rails. I would recommend something else for you to read, which is a very powerful piece by Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson in the newest issue of the American Prospect, which is basically why radical Republicans have paid no price for obstructionist policies. And a part of the reason there is we have a mass media that cannot and will not go away from the notion of false equivalence, that it's everybody's fault, that everybody's equally to blame. And if you are in a mainstream media world where your revenue is declining and your audience is declining and your advertising is declining, you're going to fall back on that refuge because you do not want to be known as biased, given the space you're trying to occupy, and because it violates all of your own internal norms anyhow. So there's no price to be paid. But the other reality of the asymmetric polarization is it's not what we typically think of as polarization, where you move from the center towards the left or the right. In this case, we're not looking at moving from the center to the right. We're looking at a party that has moved from the right to the radical right.
And as a person who's represented a lot of people charged with crack, I guarantee you, there are whole jurisdictions across this country where no white person was ever charged with possession of crack. Although, if you believe the Center for Disease Control, blacks and whites use dope at the same rates. But were not arrested, incarcerated in the same rates by any means. And so, you know, the bottom line is this whole war on drugs has bled into this school discipline policy, and yet now we're seeing Congress is trying to do a little better, not fast enough, not nearly enough. There's a lot of discussion. Even the Attorney General said mandatory minimums. We need to get rid of mandatory minimums. Always a bad idea, never a good one. You know, for Congress to sentence somebody who they've never met over and above what the judge can do. And no matter what you think of the judge, the judge is in a better position to sentence than Congress is. And yet we took that away through mandatory minimums. So it's not over yet, but the discussion is certainly there. And so we see daylight at the end of the tunnel. Everybody's questioning the war on drugs. Everybody's saying that we have gone too far in this direction. And so maybe it is. We are at that propitious moment where we can turn it around. And so I just want to encourage the Obama administration to keep it up. You guys have a lot of power in terms of shaping public opinion. And I tell you something else interesting. I really like what James had to say about saying, yes, this problem affects the black community, Latino community in an acute way, but is by no means limited to only one or two racial groups. This is a social problem across the board. And in my view, AFT and all of us here have the chance to reframe a discussion. And I'm telling you, this zero tolerance policy and the war on drugs and even the high test environment we're in all have a similar string. And the string is competition, meaning there must be winners and losers, and a zero sum. And all of these things, they're all in there. What if we said no? We believe that all Americans can do well, that there should be opportunity for everybody, that it's okay if there are only a certain number of spots in the freshman class, and you're afraid that if you give my kid opportunity, your kid won't get that spot. There's a lot of spots, and we'll make as many spots as are necessary for kids to get the education that they need. What if we said that education was not just about getting a job, but also about illuminating the mind, promoting creativity, creating a thoughtful population, making good citizens? This is what I'm talking about. It's not pie in the sky, because the people who are on the other side of this thing, the zero tolerancers, the war on drugsers, and these testers, they are clear on what they're doing. And because much of this stuff comes out of the same think tanks. We got to get clear on what we're doing.
Make no mistake about it, No Child Left Behind did not have the ability to address the fundamental inequality in America's education system. And the fact that we do not have a federal right to education, unlike other industrialized countries in the world, has undercut our ability to provide equal educational opportunity in the way that we know is most necessary to achieve the kind of equality that Judith alluded to and that I'm sure Randy will allude to. Let's start with this fact, guys. Most poor kids in the United States, and poverty, by the way, is the one criteria that now unites communities of color, Black, Latino, Asian, and communities of kids with disabilities. It unites them together. The truth is, without some kind of mandatory preschool education of high quality, Kids in poverty start off with an inherent inequality that no amount of public education is going to ultimately redress. Most kids start school with now on average of about a 15,000 word deficit if you are born in poverty, in contrast to middle class kids, and you never overcome that. And no one talks about the fact that African Americans may constitute 18% of the preschool enrolled students in the country, and yet they constitute 46% of kids who are expelled from public school. That has, from preschool education. That has nothing to do with No Child Left Behind. It has everything to do with institutionalized racism, unconscious bias, poverty, and other factors that make it impossible to achieve a level playing field for kids of color and poor kids who start school. The fact that there is fundamental inequality in resource allocation for schools is not something that you can blame on No Child Left Behind. Blame that on the failure of states to provide adequate resources for their schools. Here's an example. In New York, let's take New York, a report released just last month found that funding inequities between poor and rich school districts across the state has reached record levels under Governor Andrew Cuomo and has soared 43% in New York City. On average, the 100 wealthiest school districts in New York spend more than $28,000 in the state at local funding per student in 2012. The 100 poorest districts spent closer to $20,000 per student, an $8,000 gap. You can't tell me that $8,000 gap doesn't make a difference. You know as well as I do, in those same districts, the allocation of teachers with more skill, more training, more ability to deal with kids who have not received the benefits of a middle-class lifestyle are skewed. Those teachers generally teach in schools that have a better, quote, more disciplined student population, better resources, and are more attractive because seniority does play a significant part, and these teachers want to be treated with respect. They don't want to be seen as foisted in school districts where they're going to have challenges that go beyond what average schools or teachers rather would face. So my point here is essentially this. There are many, many problems that are collateral to education that have a real impact on the quality of education available to students. But don't blame that on ESEA. Don't blame that on No Child Left Behind. Blame that on a system that lacks the kind of controls and accountability that we think are necessary.